Oysters are delicious. A mainstay of coastal diets around the world, they are particularly popular on the Gulf Coast, with major oysteries located in Louisiana and Galveston Bay. In fact, 70% of oysters caught in the US are from the Gulf Coast. But for years, oyster populations have been under threat. Overfishing, climate change, and pollution all play a role. Apart from their value as an important and tasty protein source, though, oyster reefs help clean the water, break up incoming storms, and provide habitat for a range of other species. So, what's causing the decline in oyster populations? How is it impacting local oyster economies, and what can we do about it? I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. Before we jump into our conversation, I want to remind you that KPFT Houston is currently in our May fund drive. As public radio, KPFT Houston can only exist with your support. Over 90% of our funding comes from listeners like you. If you're enjoying Gulf Streams and want to support our work, please call 713-526-KPFT and pledge a donation. You can make a one-time donation or become a monthly sustainer to support our work. In the coming weeks on Gulf Streams, we'll feature conversations with experts on a range of topics, including composting, environmental research initiatives, and coal pollution in our region. If you want to become a station sustainer, ask about our memory bricks, permanent inscribed tributes to your generosity here at the studio. And during our entire pledge drive, every new sustaining pledge will automatically result in an additional donation thanks to a generous matching gift. Call 713-526-KPFT to learn about all the unique pledge drive offerings going on this month. We're delighted to bring you important conversations about environmental and climate issues here in Houston and beyond on Gulf Streams, and can only do so with your support. So please, call 713-526-KPFT. Make a one-time or sustainer donation, mention Gulf Streams, and help us keep ad-free public radio on the air here in Houston. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, which is available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. Lastly, I want to note that this is our last week with our researchers, Jaden and Sienna, who've done wonderful work all year making this show possible. You'll hear one last piece from Jaden next week, but as of now, Jaden and Sienna are off to new great adventures. We wish you the best. We have nothing but the highest of hopes for you. And I'm excited to announce that we now have a new team of excellent researchers that you, our audience, will be meeting over the next few weeks. And I'm excited to sit down with two of them today. Alex Little and Caroline Pollan. And Alex and Caroline are joining me today in a conversation with Seth Blitch, Director of Conservation at the Nature Conservancy of Louisiana. Seth Blitch, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. I appreciate being here.
All right. Could you introduce yourself to our listeners? Like, what got you interested in marine conservation and oysters specifically?
Sure. So again, my name is Seth Blitch. I am the Director of Conservation for the Nature Conservancy in Louisiana. And I got, started with oysters. They keep finding me. I don't find them, I think is how it's worked, which is weird for a sessile organism. But I'm a fifth generation Floridian, and so I grew up there. I lived there the first 44 years of my life. And I got a degree from the University of Central Florida in biology, and then I did some graduate work at the University of Florida, and my thesis topic was habitat apportionment of juvenile blue crabs. But I grew up outside. I mean, I had a feral childhood. I still don't like to wear shoes, for instance, but it included a lot of time on the water fishing with my dad and my brother, and being at the beach, and spending a lot of time, especially on the Gulf Coast of Florida. And then I spent about 16 years in public service, for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And that was in a program that was a coastal program. So it was a resource management program. And it started out in Crystal River, which is on the Gulf Coast, about an hour and 10 minutes or so north of Tampa. And then I became the regional administrator and the director of the National Estuarine Research Reserve out of Apalachicola. So I covered from Pensacola all the way to Tampa. And at the time, Apalachicola, the bay itself produced about 11% of the oysters eaten in this country commercially. So commercially harvested oysters came out of one bay, which is no small thing. Because there are bigger bays, et cetera, but it was highly productive for lots of reasons, in my opinion. The way that it was managed had a whole lot to do with it. That included that it was tonging only, there was no dredging. That included the fact that 50% of the shell had to go back out on the reefs from which it was taken. And so that, the height of the reefs and the integrity and of the reefs was maintained somewhat, even though there was, harvest for 100 years on it. And so I like to eat oysters, so all those things, I love them. All those things combined kind of got me into it. You had to pay attention to oysters when you're in Franklin County, Florida, in Appalachia. There was a time when, and still to some degree, although I think less so now since I've left, that lots of those decisions were made on the health of oysters, because that was, it had a lot to do with both people's identity to place. There's a really strong visceral sense of place, and that was largely because of people's relationship with the resource. And since oyster harvest provided many families with their living, whether it was because they were out harvesting or it was because they were shucking and preparing oysters for sale, it was important. And so you would see things like decisions at the planning and zoning level or the county commission meeting predicated on the fact, how does this impact oysters? Which was another way, I think, no one articulated it this way, but it was a way of saying, well, how does this affect me? How does it affect my family and where I'm from? So it was at the time, it was a really great place and one of those rare communities that really made decisions based on the health of a natural resource. And then I came to Louisiana about over 13 years ago. And as a state, Louisiana produces more oysters than any state in the country, again, commercially, which is not always a good measure of how oysters are doing, but it is the measure we have. And so, and that's still true for Louisiana. I can tell you that 99.9% of the oysters harvested here come off of private commercial leases, but there's 4 times the aerial coverage of public grounds, which gives you a sense of what's possible in terms of restoration and what we do or don't have in terms of production and things like that.
Sorry, can you break that down a little more for us, just to know what do you mean by aerial coverage and some of these things?
So let's say, I don't know, so I'm going to make up the figures because I don't know what they are exactly, but let's say that there is 250,000 acres that is leased to private individuals and organizations.
Okay.
And they can put culture material, so rock, it's usually rock, sometimes it's shell, but shell is, I will save that for later. And they farm their site. Usually it's on bottom culture. And many of the harvesters think of it as wild harvest, and certainly wild oysters. So they care for that space that they lease by putting material on the bottom. Oysters will grow on it. And in 12 to 18 months, sometimes 24, they'll harvest oysters, and they'll sort of start over with that process. Usually they have multiple leases, or they work different spaces in their lease differently so that they're constantly producing over time. And so let's say that's 250,000 acres statewide. That means that there's roughly a little over 1 million acres that's public. So it's not leased out. But you can, if you have the right special products license, go out and harvest oysters in these public, what are called in Louisiana, public seed grounds. Different states have different names. Texas, and I can't remember the term of art there, but it's not public seed ground, but it's essentially the same thing. And in these public seed grounds, the state actually, again, they'll culch areas, they'll put out material, usually rock, and after a certain amount of time, they'll open it to harvest to anyone with a license to harvest, but publicly. And so, but again, that makes up about 1% of the harvest, even though there's, over 4 times the space on public grounds that there is relative to private grounds. Now, not all of those public grounds would be productive. That's a certainty. Some of them are too fresh, some are too salty, or they're not dynamic enough, or they don't have the flow that they need, or something like that. But that still, to me at least, speaks to the ability to really, if you really want to invest in bringing back the resource or recovering it in a way, or expanding it as a habitat and a fishery, there's a lot of space to do that.
And
Does
I
that
mean,
make
that's
sense?
absolutely, and
Yeah.
that gets to this larger conversation we're going to be having, which is just around what oyster populations are doing and some of those methods of preserving and helping to build up populations. But before we dive into that, I want to go back for a second and first off just highlight, I'm from Louisiana, I'm from the New Orleans area, and you talking about the cultural value of oysters, right? Is I had a friend of mine over who's also from the area a couple of weeks back, and the two of us we did not grow up shucking oysters because we just, our dads and uncles and people at restaurants did that. But the two of us were like, well, we really want some broiled oysters now. And so we were doing it ourselves. And I mean, it was just this thing that was so viscerally, connected to place, and then, how we think of ourselves as kind of expat New Orleanians. And so, I mean, I think that's such a valuable and important part of this. And certainly people love to eat oysters, and they're a major part of the diet and have been across the world for time immemorial. But oysters do a lot more than just feed us. They're actually really significant in their ecosystems. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little about some of the functions that we maybe don't see or think about regularly, because most of us love to eat oysters, sure, but there's actually a lot of things they're doing beyond serving as a food source.
Yeah, that's right. And oysters were a habitat for millions of years before they became a food source for people.
Mm.
And so oysters are unique in that they're a fishery that is also a habitat. And I can't think of another fishery that's a habitat. Red drum isn't a habitat. Red snapper's not a habitat. Pink shrimp aren't a habitat. But oysters are. And principally a habitat, and they have complementary and some similar functions to other estuarine and coastal habitats like seagrass beds and like salt marshes and mangrove forests and things like that, that are really important, that help both respond to and drive a lot of the processes and functions that happen in estuarine ecosystems. And estuarine ecosystems are really cool because they're crazy dynamic, right? They're really, really dynamic places. I mean, everywhere is, but I think in estuaries, because an estuary is a receiving body for a watershed, a river, or a series of rivers, it's an area that is really prone to a lot of dynamism. So a lot of changes, especially salinity is where you see it the most. And that's a response to changes in drought and flood and things like that, and what rivers are doing. And so there's a high degree of connectivity from way up in watersheds all the way out to estuaries, and even some exchange from sort of the open ocean back. And so there's that real high level connectivity. There's a number of species, because oysters in a natural state, and that's hard to find anymore, but when you find an oyster bed or an oyster reef, it usually has a three-dimensional quality. It's a very complex structure because oysters grow really great on other oysters. And so there's a lot of interstitial space in there. And so as a habitat, if you just look at it, and even if you don't think it as a living habitat, but because of that, that rugosity, that really complex structure of shell, it provides a lot of habitat for all kinds of juvenile shrimp and crabs and fish and other things to spend all or part of their life history. And a lot of things like blue crabs, when they're really small, love oysteries because they can really get in there and they can still find ththings to eat and graze on, but they're protected from predators. They're protected from things like red drum and sheep's head, which love to eat them, or other crabs. Crabs are really terrific cannibals. And so they can really get to a size where they can start to become more mobile and outrun prey or defend themselves against prey once their claws get bigger and things like that. And so this is just one example of why reefs are important. Oysters feed by filtering water across their soft bodies, right? They're bivalves. And so there is this, oysters aren't pretty, right? There's this basically snotty looking organism that grows a shell around it. That's great for radio.
I was going to say, you're really selling people who are like, I'm not a big fan of oysters. Like, oh, they're running out to buy some oysters now.
and but they have to feed by, they absorb nutrients, and so nitrogen, phosphorus, and things like that. And to do that, they have to draw water across their bodies. Part of the body is called the mantle, and that's where they absorb a lot of these nutrients, and it helps them grow. It helps the soft tissue grow, but it also helps them put on more shell, and that grows. And if you let them, they'll grow for years and years and years. They'll get really big. I mean, I have some fossilized oyster shells from, same species that we see in the Gulf now, Chrysostrea virginica, the eastern oyster, but from like limestone quarries that would cover your whole face, and so you rarely see oysters that big because, again, they're usually grown to be harvested right away. And the handful of mature natural reefs that exist around the Gulf, or really anywhere in the world, is pretty heavily diminished for lots of reasons. But in the act of filtering, they also take out sort of excess levels of nutrients. I mean, they take out the nutrients they need and polish that. And so, lots of places, you're seeing this in New England now, where they've really lost all native oyster populations, are really trying to bring them back to help improve water quality. They're struggling to do it because water quality in some places is so bad that they can't actually restore them. But where it is happening, it has a noticeable effect. And if you think about miles and miles of oysters, millions and millions of oysters filtering 10 to up to maybe 50 gallons a day per oyster, that's a humongous level of filtration and basically cleaning of estuarine systems that happens for free once you get the oysters established, or leave them alone. And so that's quite the ecosystem service. And again, oysters kind of come in sort of two sort of settings, in that lots of oysters are intertidal, they're close to the shoreline, and they're exposed at low tides, mostly in the winter. And then there's subtidal oyster reefs, which are never exposed, but still grow closest to shore. And both of those, to differing degrees, impact how wave energy is expressed on shorelines. And in a state like Louisiana, where we have the highest rate of relative sea level rise on the planet, where we lose roughly 16 square miles of coastal wetlands annually. I mean, if we were Rhode Island, we would cease to be a state in a couple of years because we lose so much in coastal wetlands. As sort of it's a little bit of hyperbole, but it's really profound,
Oh, I well remember growing up and hearing the PSAs of every hour we lose a football field of land. So, I mean, it's absolutely.
Yeah. And I think because much of the coastal population doesn't live on the coast here, because we still, in spite of all that, still have these really expansive, productive marshes, but which aren't really habitable for humans. But again, if this were happening in a state like Florida or even Texas, where the population lives right up on the coast, I think it would be more noticeable. I don't know if there's much more you could do about it, but it would be a lot more noticeable. But so oysters act as natural wave breaks, right? They buffer the coastline. There are accounts from Louisiana, from Spanish galleons back in the 1500s, that sought refuge behind these really complex reef systems during storms. And one of the accounts was like the deck of the ship was pitching and rolling, and they finally carefully made their way through this complex of reefs, and they got behind it, and it was like it was a calm day, because that's just the kind of shoreline protection those reefs provided when they were super mature, and fairly unmolested. And again, they did it for free. And I keep saying that because when you look at the cost of coastal resilience projects and coastal restoration, they're so expensive, millions to billions of dollars. And when you're able to retain or restore natural systems like oyster reefs, that again, over time, can provide those benefits at no cost after you get them in the ground, to me, that's a pretty compelling economic argument, for taking care of, ecological resources.
Absolutely. I'm curious if you can talk a little about, and I've certainly read accounts as well, ranging across the East Coast and certainly down into the Gulf, of, yes, these kind of heralded oyster bays that existed, around the time of early colonization, and kind of the miraculous accounts of these earlier groups that came and were just, it's endless and there's amazing. What happened to cause these precipitous drops, though?
Lots of things happened, to my understanding. And, there's a paper, I can't remember the author of the paper now, but it shows how Eastern oyster populations winked out, and it started in New England and kind of went down to the mid-Atlantic and then kind of came around to the Gulf when we started to see real degradation of oyster populations in the 50s.
Mhm.
And we're probably one of the low points since we've been keeping that kind of data and paying attention right now. And so lots of things happen. Some of it was just out harvest. You mentioned there was just this, almost embarrassment of riches. And I think that's how it seemed. And oysters were an affordable source of protein for people. People that couldn't afford, beef and chicken and things like that back in the 1800s could get an oyster because they were just right there. And so I think as populations in places like New York really began to burgeon, there was just more and more pressure put on the resource. Back in the 1800s, early 1900s, and even into the mid 1900s, there was little to no treatment of things like sewage. It just went out into the Gulf. Dilution is a solution to pollution, kind of mindset. And so, pathogens that harm oysters increased. And when you harvest reefs, it's not bad. I certainly don't want to come off as sounding like I'm wagging a finger at oyster harvesters, because I think as a group, those are often people that know more about oyster ecology than anybody, because they're out there every day and they see it, and they see what happens when there are hydrologic alterations. They can tell you what's going to happen during a drought or during after a storm and things like that, because again, they're with it every day. They might not articulate it the same way as somebody that comes from a more academic background, but I think that often the relationship with the resource is much deeper and certainly more constant. So a lot of times it's laws that allow that to happen. It's not really bad actors. It's just that I think there's this fear, well, if I don't get mine now, then I won't be able to get it later because someone else will get it. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it feels true. But when you reduce the height of a reef, and I'm using my hands because you can see that on radio, but when you reduce the vertical structure of a reef, a couple things happen, and a mature reef displaces water, which means the same volume of water has to move quicker to get around it, right?
Mm.
And since oysters feed by filtering water, moving water, they want to be in moving water. So if they're in slack water, they can't feed as well and often don't make it. And so as you reduce the height of a reef, that volume of water takes less time now. I mean, it can take more time to go across the same space because there is less displacement from the reef. And so it makes feeding for those oysters harder. The other thing that happens when water slows down a lot and it's carrying a sediment load is those sediments start to fall out of suspension, right? It's kind of like how deltas are built. As water comes out of the mouth of the river, when it starts to slow down, its sediment load gets released and then starts to build land. And that land makes the water flow even farther to get to more open water and slow down. And so that's how a delta develops. That's a very, very crude description of it, but generally speaking, that's how it works. And so similarly with oysters, when you do things like reduce the height of a reef and then slow the speed of that water is traveling over it, it can almost bury itself over time. I often hear oyster harvesters say, we like to use the dredges because you have to bust up the reef, and it's the only way you can get them to grow. And I used to think, that just can't be true. How did they make it before you harvested them with, for millions of years, oysters did just fine without being busted up. But part of that is because when we're planting oysters in the bottom, we're often putting material down at grade. And in the short run, you can grow a crop of oysters in 12 to 24 months. And in that time, busting them up helps because it does knock sediment off. It'll expose some of that culture material to the side that maybe doesn't have oysters attached to it, and so more oysters can attach. And so it makes sense from a commercial harvest standpoint. But in terms of a long-term recovery or management of oysters as a habitat, that makes less sense. There's two ways to think about the resource. And again, to me, it's not an either or. There's kind of polarizing ways to look at things are usually never helpful. And it often pits interests against one another. And typically we have a lot of the same interests. It would be hard to find someone that said they wanted less oysters, no matter how they related to oysters.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answered your question, but that
No, that's great.
response, but okay.
Yeah, so actually our next question is, can you tell us a little bit about the history of the oyster industry in the Gulf?
That's an area I don't know as much about, but I can tell you what I do know, which is
No.
that, again, the Gulf, there was a paper done in, I think it was 2010, by some folks who at the time were colleagues at TNC, and it looked at oyster populations globally. And they had declined in places 50 to 85% or more, and almost everywhere in the world, Australia, nearly all of Europe, places in Latin America. And one of the places it was still less than 50% reduction was the Gulf of Mexico.
Wow.
Um, and um, and in part that's because I think, like I was telling you about Apalachicola, there were management schemes in place that returned shell back to reefs, that did things that didn't reduce the height of the reef, and really sort of, I think, took a longer view when it came to managing the resource. It was still managed as a fishery and not as a habitat, but it was managed in some places in such a way that allowed for there to be a fairly reliable industry from year to year. There's still a lot of variability within that, like there is in any kind of fishery. Um, and so, but like in Chesapeake Bay, as the methods of harvest, I'm going to say improved in quotes, but went from using just tongs off your boat, which is an insane amount of work. There's no doubt about it. It's a lot of work. You have to be a hardy soul to do it. And it takes longer. But it also impacts the height of the reef and the integrity of reefs a lot less than when they started to use sail-powered and then gas-powered dredges and things like that, which really started to quickly reduce the height of the reef and really redistribute the material, so that it needed to be maintained by putting more material on it because it lost again some of that vertical integrity and other things like that I don't even think we'll ever fully understand.
Yeah.
And so in some way that is a history. You could ask someone in the fishing industry and they would probably give you a much different history, or at least a lot of the same information, but they identify with it differently, which is totally valid and also true. But in the Gulf of Mexico, again, I think we saw populations do pretty well until about the last 20 or so years, when they really started to need to be maintained, again, through a lot of culching, or there's a lot of, I think climate change has had a pretty measurable effect on oysters in a lot of ways. Again, the amount of water quantity now, not quantity, not quality, but quantity, has really been an issue. I mean, there's a lot of bays in Texas that have gotten hypersaline because so much water that used to feed that estuary is wrapped up in land-based ag or just plain old municipal need. And again, that's not to wag a finger at anybody. That is just sort of, I think it's a failure, societal failure in managing natural systems that's connected. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's a new concept. At least it's new to a lot of us. I think
Yeah.
a lot of Native peoples understood that implicitly. But in the last couple hundred years, in really a lot of places, I think we've forgotten about that. We don't live as close to resources as we used to. And so thinking about them and managing them as habitats that are necessarily and causally connected has impacted oysters negatively. And so, we have places that flood, and to get rid of the water quickly, we make canals that are straight and it flushes it right out. And then we have these really periods of very low salinity, which oysters can tolerate, but if it stretches on into many weeks or months, then they won't feed, they'll close. And that's fine, again, for a time, but not feeding for a long time is a death sentence. Conversely, if we're retaining a lot of water during a drought in systems and rivers don't reach the Gulf in this case like they should, then we get higher than normal salinities in these estuaries. Again, for a prolonged, oysters love it. They grow really quick during high salinities. But when it lasts for a long time, incidence of disease predation goes up. And so you start to see productivity drop in those reefs. And so it's more of a life history than a industry history, but that's what I know more about. Does that
No,
help?
that's totally.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. And you talked a lot about kind of the different factors that are depleting some of the oyster populations in the Gulf. And so perhaps one of the biggest environmental disasters to occur here on the Gulf Coast was the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So the question is, can we still feel those effects today, 14 years later?
The honest answer is I don't know, because there is so much signal to noise, I think, associated with that. I think we could say with all certainty that it didn't make things better. And through a lot of the natural resource damage assessment work that was done, there was some good science put to oysters, well, put to all affected species, but oysters, that estimated in the hundreds of millions of larvae were lost and things like that. And so there was an effort to quantify loss of recruitment, loss of habitat, for existing reefs and things like that, and project that out over time and sort of think about, well, what would it take to bring oysters back that we lost, and the potential that we also lost along with it. And so that is one of the primary purposes of the natural resource damage assessment process. And so I think that the spill came at a time where, again, we were already having a hard time with reefs because of some of the hydrologic issues I mentioned, because of, I think we had ways of managing oysters that were good when the laws were written, but the state of the resource had changed and the laws had not changed with them. Where I came from in Apalachicola, Florida, like I said, 50% by law, 50% of the shell had to go back out onto reefs. They were saved and collected from behind shucking houses. They were put out in the sun for at least 6 months, so they were safe to put in the water again, loaded back onto barges, and put right back onto the reefs. It's a really simple but genius system. That stopped because the management responsibilities changed under their agency, which didn't have an appropriation to maintain that kind of work. And so that's not the only thing that happened, but that was a really terrible drought in 2011 and 2012, and some other things really conspired to have the oyster industry there crash. And that bay was closed several years ago now, to any kind of oystering, and will be until at least 2025, so next year. And I don't know how it's doing. I've talked to some people that say it's coming back. I've talked to many others that say it's just not. And there was a period where a lot of that parent material, the shell that was there and the shell that it was built onto and all of that was lost. And so it's, when you lose stuff, it's destruction is quick for whatever the reason, and restoration is really, really a long-term game, and really difficult when you've lost a lot of that function. And so I think that the oil spill exacerbated an ongoing problem, for sure. I don't even think we'll know the degree to which the oil or the correxit or any of that, had an impact on a lot of things. I think that everyone was doing the best they could in response to the spill, for sure, thinking about human health and the environment and all of that. Given the circumstances through which everyone was working. I was still in Florida when it happened. I was actually given a talk on coastal resilience. It was Earth Day, if you remember, and I was down in Tampa, and we got called, and in the Panhandle of Florida, we were feeling pretty bad about it, before anything even got there, and there was a huge effort to do all kinds of things to reduce the amount of harm, and try to learn as much as we could, if we didn't know it already, about what the resources we had on the coast were. But I think that, anyway, I believe it's probably a contributing factor. At the same time, it's put a lot of attention and funds and energy into recovering all kinds of resources and habitats, including oysters. And so in a lot of ways, it's been a way that we're able to pay a lot more attention to the resource that we may not have. I'm not advocating for disasters as a way.
You're not pro oil spill in general.
I'm not. I'm just. That's a bad business model, and think about learning more about resources and restoration. But I think for what it was, again, it did present an opportunity to really apply some resources and collaboration and collective thinking towards a lot of these habitats, like oysters, that really hadn't existed in that kind of way before.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I have a question sort of looping back to what you were discussing about salinity. So recently, the Galveston and Trinity Bays in Texas have received an influx of fresh water due to recent extreme weather. And the fresh water has significantly decreased the salinity of the bays, which, as you mentioned, threatens the livelihood of the oyster populations there. And as climate change continues to change weather patterns and precipitation patterns, potentially bringing more severe storms, which not only increase freshwater input, but might also bury reefs in sediment, as you referenced, how do you predict oyster populations will withstand these environmental changes post-restoration?
Well, I can. So at the Nature Conservancy, one of the things that all 5 business units in the Gulf have, which is the 5 Gulf states, is we all have just varying degrees oyster restoration, shoreline protection type projects. Some of these are intertidal reefs right up against the shore, and some of them are subtidal reefs. Texas has a good number of subtidal reef projects. The one I think we're probably most well known for is the work that we did several years ago in Matagorda Bay, the Half Moon Reef Project. But there's also been stuff in Copano Bay, Galveston Bay. There's an ongoing project there now, and these are all not near the shore, but they are subtidal projects. And again, these are areas that have been impacted, I think, by climate change in terms of again, water quantity, delivery of water to these bays. The projects we have in Louisiana are exclusively intertidal, just because one of our needed outcomes is shoreline protection, because we're losing so much the shoreline. And so any kind of wave abatement benefits we can get from these projects are and as soon as we can get them, are crucial. I think that in terms of how restoration and restored oyster populations will adapt to climate change is still an open question in a lot of ways. They're going to have to be hardy, and it may be like it always is, natural selection. Those that really can survive extreme periods of drought and flood, and produce offspring that are more adapted to either end of the salinity scale, will do well. And I don't know if that will happen. I think another thing that will happen is, again, in places like, this is true everywhere, but again, it's especially true in Louisiana, where you see this shape of the coastline changing, and then the coast sort of moving in and claiming areas that it hasn't seen in thousands to tens of thousands of years. The ability for oyster populations to migrate where they do have the right kind of salinities is key, and that means historically that meant areas where there's kind of coarse riverine alluvial deposits, right? So oyster larvae float around out there, and they have to settle on something that they is big enough for them to attach to and grow, because once that's happened, they're not moving again until they reproduce. And so that used to be some of the coarser sediments that fell out of suspension early in rivers, and so kind of close to mouths of rivers, and again, that had that salinity that was good and variable. It had periods of flood that brought a lot of nutrients and food to them, and then it had periods of drought where they experienced better growth, and frankly, they taste better when they're salty. And so I think that both of those things, I think just we'll see how tolerant oysters are to what seem to be increasingly extreme weather conditions. And we'll also learn, and I think this is where we have more influence, plan about anticipating where oysters can be next and be successful as the coast changes, and especially as a lot of the coast gets converted into salt marshes and things like that. And so I think those are the two things to really pay attention to. And again, sometimes I think there's very little we can do to control that. other than pay attention to it and say, all right, well, here's where these are the conditions under which we're now seeing success in oyster populations. And that might only be for 30 years until the next change. But I think there's going to be a certain amount of vigilance for not just oysters, but for all habitats and species, where we have to really say, all right, here's, again, in the face of a changing climate, a rapidly changing climate, the climate's always changed, but one that's changing so fast, these are the kinds of things we need to look out for if we really, want to preserve these habitats and these functions. At the same time, I think also thinking about the hydrology that drives a lot of the production in estuaries is important, and always has been, and will continue to be. And so, integrated floodplain management programs that really look at floodplains as nested systems that ultimately have an outcome in an estuary, which is not to say the estuarine side is more important than any particular basin, but just that those are, again, causally linked. And so thinking about those things and having a sense of connection to place, even a place you've never been, matters. And and thinking about that in a kind of, again, connected, almost reciprocal kind of way, I think is important. It's something that we're not very good at doing when it comes to natural resource management or policy setting and things like that, because I think until recently we haven't had to think that way. But I think that's another thing that will continue to be more and more important, whether it's oysters or seagrass beds or whatever you're talking about, longleaf pine. I just think that you would have a hard time saying, oh yeah, this habitat exists all by itself and doesn't need anything else. That's not real in nature, right? And so the more we manage with that realization in mind, the better chance that all these habitats have.
Great. So we were talking about salinity. I guess oysters clearly face a lot of challenges, from overharvesting to salinity changes, as we were just saying. So what are organizations, the Nature Conservancy included, doing in terms of conservation work? For example, what strategies and techniques are being employed, and do you see them working?
Sure. So, of course, ours are working. No, it's I always tell people that we just have variable levels of success. We've had some projects that we put in really early, like 15 years ago, when that was really, TNC and others were sort of on the vanguard of this in a lot of ways, and we were just like, well, we'll put something out and stuff. Oysters will settle and grow on it. Larvae will grow on it. And that's true, but you still have to pay attention to what the salinity regime is over time. And structure matters. We had some structures that we used that work better than others. But we've done a lot of work by putting out different kinds of substrates, again, either intertidally or subtidally, and letting larvae settle and grow on it and then reproduce on their own. And we've gotten better at siting those projects in places where the word that we always use is durability, which I think is become incredibly it's been so overused now, it doesn't mean anything, but where oysters will really kind of maintain themselves in a long run. Again, recognizing that the discussion we just had, that things are changing faster than they normally would. But so again, we've had variable amounts of success. I remember I mentioned the Half Moon Reef project in Matagorda Bay. That's been wildly successful. It's grown a lot of oysters, which have maintained themselves. The work that we've done in Calcasieu Lake in the southwest part of the state has been particularly good. We've had several mortality events related to high water. Like as soon as we put out the first reefs back in 2017, we got recruitment and settlement of larvae, and they started to grow, and you could start to see little oysters. And then we had Hurricane Harvey, which I think, there around Houston was like 36 inches plus of water in, a couple of days. And I think we only got 28 inches that came down the Calcasieu Basin, which is still just, an insane amount. I mean, it's like biblical amounts of water. And it made all of Calcasieu Lake, which is an estuary, completely fresh for months at a time. And it killed everything. It killed oysters.
No.
But they came back because, again, we had oysters. We had some vertical structure, and so they didn't get buried during that storm, and they haven't gotten buried in any subsequent storm. And so, this last winter, when we had that one day where everything got down into the teens, I think down there it got down to about 14 degrees. And, cold weather days are associated with fronts, which means you have north wind. So it pushed all the water out of the bay and exposed the oysters, which is, again, normally okay. But it was so cold for so long that many of them froze in their shells and died. But if you think about the tons and tons of rock we put out there, we put them out in wire cages, that was still there, plus all the oysters that had recruited and grown over several years. And so there's way more substrate out there than there used to be. And so when the conditions returned, it was a place for these larval oysters to continue to settle, grow, reproduce. And so in that way, we've had some real good success. Other organizations do shell recycling. And I think that's really critical. I think collecting shell just from restaurants and things like that is a great thing to do. You can get a lot of shell. I still think by doing that, you can't come close to the amount of substrate you need. And so I would like to see states start to really value shell as a resource, and rather than digging a hole in the ground in Missouri or Kentucky and hauling lime rock down here, we're growing our own anyway. And so retain a certain amount of shell and put it back onto reefs, at least in the public sphere. I think that makes a lot of sense. I fully recognize that shell is commoditized too, and to ask people to give shell up now would be ask them to forfeit some of their income. And so I think there has to be some pretty creative thinking and really robust stakeholder engagement when it comes to, well, how do you make something like that work that doesn't hurt people in the industry already financially who are up against it, but that also starts to ensure the long-term recovery and success of oysters as both a habitat and a fishery. And so those are kind of the things that NGOs get involved in primarily. There's some policy work too that we do occasionally. Oysters are, at least the eastern oyster that we have in the Gulf, they're managed state by state because they're all in state waters. And so the management looks different from state to state. So thinking about instituting a policy across a region like the Gulf of Mexico or a country like the US is pretty daunting and almost impossible, because you would be asking states to do it the same way. And there would just
be a lot of resistance to that.
There would be an insane amount of resistance, and implementation would be really difficult. You couldn't come up with a way to do it because there's still a lot of variability. And again, when you get to the West Coast, you have completely different species. And so you really have to, when it comes to policy, it really is a state by state approach. And I think state agencies, again, do a good job of managing the resource with the laws that they have and the rules and statutes that are available. But I think that there's probably, room for those to evolve that meet today's needs, that again, treat the resource as a habitat and a fishery that are linked. And the habitat side is the bank for the fishery in a lot of ways, and having a robust habitat and a robust fishery are, I think, mutually beneficial.
Well, I want to go back for a second because I'm really fascinated by the kind of idea of shell as a resource that you brought in, just because, there's thousands of years of history of people using shells as a building material, as a barrier substance. And so I am curious if there is potential there, whether it's to some extent you're talking about people giving it up, but on the inside of that, could we actually utilize shells as a resource in a way that helps to compensate some of these farmers, and maybe would become a different approach to how we're thinking about oyster shells as material? It seems like there are ways there that we could actually alleviate some of these tensions and actually use this really valuable material.
There have been efforts to do that. There are some states that pay oyster farmers or harvesters so much per sack of shell or whatever that they give back. Louisiana is not one of those states right now, and I'm just not very versed in how successful those projects and programs are. I have heard that a lot of times people just don't avail themselves to it because for private growers, the shell is still more valuable to keep and put on their lease than it is to sell back to the state. Texas, a couple of years ago, I think, mandated through one of their legislative sessions that about 30% of the shell off of public grounds had to go back onto those public grounds, or the harvesters had to pay the financial equivalent of what it would cost to buy that much culture material. And again, I don't know if that's changed since then. I don't know how successful it's been, but yeah, I mean, that's the rub, right? Is figuring how to make something like that work so that there are the resources in the public sphere for agencies to collect and put shell back out on reefs. And it's done in a way that is, again, not an economic detriment to people in the industry. And some of that might be actually involving the industry in managing some of the public resources. I know that there will be many, and having a public service background myself, that would say, well, private interest in public resources can be tricky, and it can be. But many of the leaseholders I know and people that grow oysters, even through aquaculture, off-bottom aquaculture in cages, are really good at growing oysters. And so the idea of being able to have a more diverse portfolio around the same resource, so that when you have times of the year or years that you can't have harvest, but you can still work to maintain the resource, might be one way to look at it. So that your livelihood doesn't depend solely on extraction, but it depends more on stewardship.
Well, and it would seem, I mean, you open by really talking about, industry knows this ecology so well because they're living it day in, day out. I mean, it does seem like a natural place where having conversations, working together, really trying to make this is a very invested party that wants oysters to survive and thrive. It certainly seems like it makes sense. We're rapidly running out of time with you, and are just so grateful to have gotten to have this conversation. But before we wrap, I just want to ask, what are other ways that locals, either individuals or through businesses, can get involved in supporting some of these conservation efforts? Do I need to feel guilty when I'm eating oysters? Should I be eating more oysters? Please say I should be eating more. Should we be getting involved in oyster recycling? But I'm just curious if you have any kind of suggested steps for folks on how to keep this wonderful food source and material that we love so much around.
Yeah, I think as a consumer, actually being really interested in how it's sourced and where it comes from, and again, not with a critical eye to, oh, well, that's good or bad, but just to know what part of the world your oysters come from is important, and to know whether they were grown off bottom culture, in cages, or whether they, were part of wild stock somewhere, natural reefs. I think just that kind of interest helps, like the restaurant industry and the seafood industry, they know that that's important. And to be sure, sort of boutique oysters is becoming more of a movement now. It's weird, I talked earlier about how, as a source of protein, 100+ years ago, it was what anyone could afford. And now, it's almost like, well, anyone can afford a hamburger or a chicken sandwich, and it's, getting oysters is not just for everybody anymore. And some of that is just what the market does, but some of that speaks to how oyster population availability just isn't what it used to be. But I think asking restaurants if they recycle their shell, again, not in an admonishing kind of way, but just because it communicates your interest into sort of the sustainability of where food comes from and how it's produced. I think that kind of stuff matters. I think getting to know people who produce oysters personally is actually a really great way to do it. There's all kinds of farm to table movements out there around different kinds of ag, vegetable crops, beef, and things like that, where you can go and spend time with farmers, and they will tell you how they are stewards of the land and how they deliver food to you. And a lot of oyster growers are starting to do this too. And they get pretty good, patronization. A lot of places have like areas where you can go out, you can tour the oyster farm. This is mostly for aquaculture now. And then you can come back and, buy some oysters and drink a couple beers, near the dock. And that's become a really kind of popular thing to do. And because it's fun, and because you really, again, you get that sense of place and that sense of community about your food. And so I think that, oysters are something that really almost anywhere in this country still can be fairly local. if you're on the coast, but oysters grow nearly everywhere on, the Gulf, Atlantic, and Pacific sides, and so um, it's something that you can be within a couple hundred miles of easily. And so I think it's a, I don't know, it's a way to get to know not just more about what you're eating, but about the story behind it. And we love stories, and so it is probably more amenable to that storytelling part of the food supply than a lot of other things are.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. Seth Blitch is the Coastal and Marine Conservation Director, Louisiana, for the Nature Conservancy. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. I enjoyed it. I appreciate the time.
To learn more about Seth's work, you can go online and visit the Nature Conservancy's website at nature.org. For this week on How to Get Involved, we'd like to let you know about a really exciting event happening on Friday. So, at the Deluxe Theater on this Friday, there'll be a screening of Can't Stop Change, which is being hosted by a number of really fantastic environmental organizations in town, including Air Alliance Houston and SEER, two groups who've been on the program many times. This is a really interesting documentary, especially targeted around Pride Month, and it's thinking through LGBTQ plus communities and how they're more vulnerable to air pollution issues and the various impacts on their health, as well as broader environmental disasters. So this will be at the Deluxe Theater on Friday. The doors open at 6 p.m. You can RSVP in advance if you visit Air Alliance's website or SEER's website, and you'll be able to learn all about the event. There'll also be a health fair that follows right after the screening. So it's a really great way to get involved, meet other folks who are interested in some of these environmental issues in town, and to learn more about specific issues targeting local people here in our community. So that's Friday, 6 p.m. at the Deluxe Theater. Finally, I'd like to remind listeners that KPFT is in our May Fund Drive. To support programming, please call 713-526-KPFT. Press 1 for donations and mention Gulf Streams when you pledge to help keep our work going. This work is only possible with your generous support, so please call in to 713-526-KPFT Extension 1. Make a pledge to keep us on the air and bringing you the most important stories about the environment and our changing climate here in Houston. Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about a range of new environmental research initiatives happening here in Houston. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray Boyce, Sienna Yen, Caroline Pollan, Alex Little, and Jessica Zoom. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.